just getting used to things. Anyway, folk, hopefully everything is connected on both Facebook Live and, of course, on YouTube. If you guys can obviously see and everything, just comment or whatnot. You can obviously ask your questions, and I'm pretty sure we'll get around to it. So if you can ask, if you comment anything, I'll get around to obviously responding. And of course, today I'm obviously speaking about things to do with Hong Kong. I've got a friend who is originally from Hong Kong. He's been living in the United Kingdom since 2012. You know, and he knows quite a fair bit. He's a classical liberal. Of course, I respect everybody in their own personal view. Thank you, Pee Wee. I greatly appreciate. Hello. So it's always good just making sure everything's running okay. Yep, that's everything. Great. So that's basically where everything is going with this topic issue, and as you know, there's a bit of a run up to what led to the current issues of what you've seen in Hong Kong. So basically, as I say, Mike is originally from Hong Kong, so he certainly knows a fair bit that you might gather some information, some useful information anyway. So essentially this, if I can just, yep, so obviously Mike, just to give a wee introduction to yourself and that, to folk, so that you can, explain where you're coming from and stuff, and how you got into classical liberalism. I mean, how was it that what led you to all of that, and basically just a wee introduction to yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your channel, both Facebook and YouTube. It's my honor. Well, for me, I mean, I was born and raised in Hong Kong, as you said. Well, at that time, it's still British Hong Kong. And, well, my family always tell me that we have to work hard. I mean, not rely on the government in most of the aspect. Obviously, in some aspect, traditionally, they have some concerns about whether the free market and whether this is the best way to deliver that. But when I grow up, I mean, basically overall, we are in a very pro-freedom and free market household, shall I say it this way. But until when I grew up, like until my A-level time, I mean, I have the privilege to be inspired by some of the a very respectable economics. He inspired me a lot, especially on neoclassical economics, that really helped me to understand about free market and liberalism. I mean, classic liberalism, to be specific. And this helped me a lot. I mean, he basically laid me down the foundation of what I have. Of course, I still go out to explore. I review literatures, I read books, and that's how I came into my position. And obviously, I am not a pure, how should I say, a one-side classic liberal, because now I know this will be controversial. I'm a half Keynesian. Now I know that most of the classical liberal, when they talk about Keynesian, they will have a nature of hate coming into there. But I have to explain my position here first of all. When I say half Keynesian, I believing that John Keynes, first of all, we should see beyond the Keynesian model. You see, most of the people have only focusing on this work of the Keynesian model or the general theory as a whole. Now, I'm not suggesting that is not an important work, but most importantly, he has a lot of contributions beyond the Keynesian model that most of the people have ignored, and sometimes I will argue misunderstand. Now, he raised a lot of good questions in economics-wise. Now, I do not agree with all of his answers. I agree some of his answers, but I believe in that we shouldn't just have a complete rejection of everything what John Keynes stands for. For example, what I agree will be like, I believe in that, like Keynes agree that there's no such thing called full employment. Now, this is something that many people ignore, that actually John Keynes is against this concept, and I agree that because you can always have some people have a we call structural unemployment, or there will be some poverty here. It's about big or small. And we all agree that, in you and I, the free market is the best way to minimize the poverty. This is the first question. The second thing is that traditionally, the interest rate before Keynes is basically, they say that it's about investment and saving. And basically, it depends on how much saving get into the banking system and how much investment take out. And as a result, the interest rate has been decided. Actually, John Keynes has raised a very good question. So we have a bond market, right? So people can choose to raise the money through the bond market instead of through the banking system. So it is another thing that I agree, and actually raised a very good question. In fact, he is also a pioneer in get this financial market into the economics model. Now, he's not the first one to try to do it, but he's a pioneer. That thing I respect him. For example, like you have the supply curve. His mentor in economics, Alfred Marshall, who was the leader of the Cambridge School of Economics in the late 19th century. He believed there was something called short-run supply curve and long-run supply curve. And actually, Keynes dispute that and basically say, look, the reason you have a long-run and short-run because sometimes you have to build machines, right? You don't have the machines right away. They said, look, if you have the money, you can go to the stock market to buy all these companies, and these machines will be yours. So that is the way that my view on that. And also, most of the people have ignored Keynes' points. For example, like Keynes was always a severe critic of irresponsible government spending. Now, we know that there's a period of the German government when they're approaching to the end of the World War I, to the early state of Weimar Republic, they have a hyperinflation. He was a severe critic of the handling of the German government. Basically, they say that because the hyperinflation is because of the irresponsible spending. In fact, in his book, Attack of Monetary Reform, he is so vocal that he even say that the way to destroy the nation is to destroy the currency. So that will explain why back to the general theory, he believing that, first of all, he does not agree with a permanent increase of government spending.
Yep.
Most of the left wing has run this kind of spin, which is nonsense, because he never agreed with that, because he is a critic of irresponsible government spending. So he's been very consistent this thing. And secondly, this is something that I disagree again, that he believing that we have created deficit, right? So as a result, when the economy is better, we should tax the economy to pay back this money. But the trouble is that if you tax them, the economy will shrink because they have less money inside, right? Based on his theory. So we're going to have a recession again. So there will be an endless cycle. You see what I mean?
Yep.
And also one final thing that I disagree that because he believing that because there's a recession, the private sector is shrinking. As a result, the public sector will step in.
Yep.
But the trouble is that we all knew that the public sector is never be efficient in running everything. Quite honest with you. So that is the differences that I disagree with. So that's why I call myself half Keynesian, not a full Keynesian, because I can see he's raised some legitimate points. I can see he really have something good, but I dispute the things that I disagree, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's very interesting of what you say, and I completely agree with you in terms of the Keynesian, economics and stuff. I can understand that initially what he proposed was only, basically to temporarily have the borrowing and spending only for a short period to allow, consumers to spend more during a recession. So, for example, here in the United Kingdom, as you know, we're currently in a recession. As I've argued and I've stated before, that what accelerated that recession forward was the lockdown. In other words, what I say to people is the fact that the lockdown was not the cause of the recession was already coming. Unfortunate as it is to say, it was 90 plus odd years of the issue of the continual printing, borrowing and spending, the fractional reserve banking, and that was all in relation to what Keynesianism unfortunately became, because I've always argued between the theory and practice argument, And theoretically, I mean, I completely agree with where you're coming from. Where what Keynes initially proposed was, of course, the borrowing and spending during just a short period when the economy is not doing so well. So, for example, a recession. But what he did not propose was what you see what the socialists have been doing. They've been recklessly, borrowing and spending even during periods when the economy's been doing better. And of course, it's gone down the quite the wrong road, so to speak. And I think that's the main reason why there is such an issue with the Keynesian economics, because in practice, unfortunate as it is to say, you will get these governments who go on the path of its own, and unfortunately it does go down the road of what you're speaking about. But I do fully comprehend where you're coming from, and there was quite an interesting question in relation to that, a few by Pee-wee he had obviously asked, and of course United Democratic Union had said hello Scotty and Mike, it's good to see you, and as Pee-wee had asked the question, he said something about the monetarist school of economic theories, and then he went on to ask it the question, what was it Milton Friedman that founded the monetarist school of economic theory? So what would be your response to that as such?
Well, first of all, mostly we argue that Friedman is the leader of the monetarist theory. He's not a solo contributor. He is basically the leader, and in basically addressing the questions on the monetarist theory, he is biggest proponent. I mean, of course, after he leave the academic scene, I mean, there are someone trying to go further ahead, for example, like Robert Lucas Jr., but which I will respectfully say he's a crap economicist. I mean, I know who I'm criticizing, by the way. I know who I'm criticizing. I'm criticizing Nobel Economic Prize winner. But his rational expectation is not matching the real world. I mean, what he's saying is purely theoretical basis, but not matching the real world. That is I always argue. So I would argue that probably in practice, Friedman is the one that I share quite a lot of things agree. In fact, I would argue that I'm 70 to 80% of Friedman economics. If you want to call the term of what Milton Friedman stands for, but I have the things that I disagree with him. I was inspired by him a lot, so this will perhaps explain my position on Friedman and my view on Friedman overall. Of course, I have. If you have time, I can even talk about what I disagree with Friedman. For example, like some of his theories, like price theories. I always said that the funny thing is that there are quite a lot of the economics theory are actually named by that person is not really developed by him. For example, like Friedman famously have a price theory. He called them the Marshallian demand curve. I can assure you that this is nothing but Marshallian. Alfred Marshall has written it very clear that he is against what the so-called Marshallian demand curve is doing. So, but we haven't discovered someone who write this demand or derived this demand curve before. So what is likely is that it is a Milton Friedman's demand curve. But for some reason, he don't have the guts to write that. It is his work. Yeah, so this is a very funny thing.
I find it obviously really interesting, obviously, from your perspective. And I've always been a great admirer of Milton Friedman's work and stuff. I absolutely loved his own documentary, which was on the Free to Choose, and of course the documentary was the whole thing to do with the free market, and he mentioned about the Industrial Revolution. There's a lot I learned from him, of course. I'll never forget his own words when he says, a contribution denotes voluntarism and stuff like that. He was a very, very intelligent man. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. I'm pretty sure he influenced quite a number of people. So yeah, I mean, he's a really, really interesting figure, and he just had a way of answering folk that, people didn't know how to come back to him. I mean, he was a really intelligent man, and he was the one that argued strongly with the free market in Hong Kong. So I can more than understand why many people, even including yourself, would have taken influence from a lot of what Milton Friedman had argued. I think that about the only issue that I would disagree with Milton Friedman on, of course, was to do with the I think the central banking issue and stuff, and maybe a few other things, because I'm more influenced towards the Mises Institute and the Austrian school stuff, but he was a very intelligent figure. Of course, PB asked, does China enforce intellectual property laws? Well, we'll get around to that, PB. Don't worry. We'll get around to these sort of questions and stuff like that. I'm just looking to see any other questions you got. Does China enforce? I think that's the one. This one, he says, how high is the tax rate in China? Again, we'll get around to that very soon. No worries. And of course, David Friedman continues his legacy. He's quite an interesting figure. I don't know too much about David Friedman, but of course, it's just one of those things.
He's basically Anglo-capitalist. ANCAP.
Yep.
David Friedman is an ANCAP. Just to give you a point, really.
Yep. So, Mike had obviously, sorry, Pee Wee had obviously asked you, Mike, about the monetarist thing. Are you a monetarist? He's asking.
I'm leaning towards monetarist. I'm not 100% monetarist, because some you could argue that basically there are two approaches in understanding monetarist. You could argue that whether this is about the long-term relationship between about the price and inflation, and about the about all this kind of thing of, for example, like multiplying effect and all the other things. I would sum up my position. In general, I believe most of the time that I'm a monetarist. I believe in that the price level is indeed affected mainly by the how much money we print, how much money we have circulating in the economy in most of the time. So I believe in that this is not the only factor, but I recognize that this is a big factor.
Mm-hmm.
So this will be my answer.
I mean, I agree with you. I mean, at the end of the day, we have slight differences, of course, as you know, and I've always been an admirer of the gold and silver standard, and I've long argued that the problems that had occurred in, for example, the 19th century. You take, for example, what Alexander Hamilton did. Although he accepted gold and silver, when he formed the First National Bank in 1792, he fixed the ratio of the money between gold and silver, and what that did was it wiped gold out of the market, made silver the dominant standard, and then he did the same, well, not him, but after his death later in 1834, they did the same thing. And what led to basically a problem was the trying and testing of the paper currency. You'd probably have heard of the greenback currency, and it used to be a case where you used to just have the gold or the silver. Well, at the time, gold was the dominant standard, and eventually what came was, the gold would then be backed by this paper, and the paper would be backed by the gold, sorry, and this was how the exchange would thing me. And unfortunately, it was that trying and testing of the paper currency, which is why I wasn't really a big fan of it, because it would lead to the Panic of 1893. And unfortunately, I think gold or silver, would wrongly get the blame. And it's a bit like, it's like I say, I mean, with the central banking system, of course, we'll get on to speaking about that soon enough, but there was the issue with the fixing of the interest rates. But that's a very, very interesting point. I've got another comment here. It's by the Random Gamers. He says, sorry I'm late, guys, just got back from work. So yeah, it's good to see obviously you guys and everything. I'm just obviously getting everything. So we'll move on to a question. Obviously, because I've got them down and stuff like that. So this question is, what is it that led you to support the free market economy and the school of thought that most influences you. So I've asked that. So what? So the next question would be, what was Hong Kong like from your perspective before 97 and after 97? Because I think this is a quite an important question. So what would you say to that, Mike?
Well, I would first of all, when Hong Kong's handover, I was still a small kid, but I do have the understanding of what my family and parents told me, and well, I would, and then of course I do my own research also. I would argue that the free market, which should be in the post World War II scenario, we're focusing on this area, would roughly divided in three periods, I mean, of Hong Kong. The first one will be after the Second World War, or mainly actually after 1949, when the PRC established, until around late 1970s, around 1980 time. There is not a very clear cut-off time. This is the first period of time. The second period of time will be 1980s, around that period, and then 1997. And after that will be 1997 until now. Now, during the first period of time, there is quite a genuine free market there. Of course, there will be a very small amount of government intervention there, as I'm sure that everyone will agree that it is very difficult to completely eliminate the government intervention. That's why I love Copperface's term, positively non-interfering. This is a very good term coined by him. And the next thing is that what happened is that I believe in that there are increasingly in the late 1960s until the early 1970s increase of government spending and some of the welfare programs. But it's still very small. I wouldn't call this, and I have to stress that until today, when you're comparing the today welfare programs that we have, or comparing with other welfare state countries, or even some of these countries like Scandinavians, Hong Kong's welfare programs overall is still small. I have to say very clear. But if you compare with the proportion that we're having, actually in the 1960s and 70s, they start to grow, okay? But they still are a very small amount of them. And then the reason I pick up the 1980s as a cutoff point is because according to declassified documents, we knew that actually the British government knew that if they want to negotiate the extension of the new territories, which is part of the Hong Kong, they cannot. Deng Xiaoping is very firm on this area. This is a very strong political standpoint. So as a result, they are preparing to hand over, which is illegitimate, by the way, as I always suggest, is that the no referendum was granted, and we, the British Chinese, has been excluded from the boardroom to discuss our own fate. There's no democratic mandate at all. So, but in order to preserve the British interest, they start to run an oligopoly system. Because their logic is very simple. What they are doing is they're trying to help some of the British Chinese merchants or businessmen or tycoons over in Hong Kong to help them grow. Because once you have oligopoly system, you are basically, if your counterpart is making money, you are making money, isn't it? The basic logic of oligopoly system. That is how they preserve the British interests in all the areas. And of course, after 1997, I would argue that it is completely go for full corporatism. But of course, because between 1980s and 1997, the welfare program is keep expanding, the government spending is keep expanding. This is true. Well, we'll not cry about that. And between 1997 afterwards, it's basically entered a corporatism area, where one of the richest men in Hong Kong's son can get a project. Simply, he proposed something. And the government simply do not seek for like public tendering. I mean, very basic thing, inviting proposals, to do so, and just simply give the project out. And for what? Just simply because who he is, who family background is. And by the way, that project has been as a cyberport. That time is a very well-known the IT bubble, right? And what happened was that actually the cyberport later became to be a luxury property development. So anyway, and then next we have the MPF, the mandatory pension funds. Basically, they are forcing the employees to pay a certain amount of their salaries to get into a fund, to buy funds. Now, what happened is that you are forced to pay this. So, if you're forced to pay this, then at least you should supposed to be, you have a right to choose who manages the money, right? No, you don't. It is the employers to choose which funds which fund managers that you are in. But the only thing you choose is about what level of risk that you're willing to take. That is the problem. And of course, later we see other things else. For example, like the minimum wage in later, like in the late 2010 to 2009 or 2010, and the things is only getting worse. And they're trying to run for basically a state pension system. But the funny thing is that when people are proposing that the state pension system, they calculated that actually the government calculated. I think if they will have, they're the financial unsustainable until like 240, 250. I forgot exactly it is. But that is the problem. I mean, the people just become very, very opposed. I mean, what is unsustainable? So you see that, of course, it didn't proceed ahead. But you can see that it is growing to the way of corporatism. And this is how I want to divide the boundaries here.
Yeah, it's obviously a very interesting perspective, obviously, of Hong Kong before 97 and obviously over from the 70s leading onwards. You would unfortunately see the issues become more and more oligopolistic, and especially after 1997, and corporatism is just more or less taking over. And that's why I've long argued to people, obviously there's a difference between what Hong Kong used to be, especially before 97, to that of after 97, and it's good obviously to hear that coming from your own perspective, because you obviously grew up there. I mean, your parents as well. Your parents had lived through the era, and you would have taken a lot of influence, especially from your parents and whatnot. And as of course Pee-wee mentions there, fascism is socialism on steroids. Well, that's essentially it. I mean, a lot of people think of, and I've argued this many times before, and it's, with the corporatism. I mean, you would agree with regards to the fascism issue. People have heard it from me many times before, Mike. So what do you say in response to, obviously I just clicked away, but what do you say in response to what Pee-wee had just stated there, with regards to the fascism thing? Because I'll tell you, I mean, it really is just another type of socialism. It's just a case that it's more the socialist government direction of the economy, of private industry. And that's what you see through, the likes of China today. It's, you see it with
Yep.
Hong Kong. So, I mean, what do you say in response, obviously, to, for example, of what he's saying?
Well, I mean, fascism and socialism basically are the same in my view. I mean, they are basically still all. Well, in fact, if you take a look, the funny thing is that fascism has a root in socialism. I mean, for example, like Mussolini was one time a socialist. I mean, I do not know whether people actually noticed that. I mean, and if you take a look at all the fascisms that we have seen, they have a one common thing: socialism. They need someone to centralize the whole thing in order to make sure it works. I mean, they never go out. I mean, both Nazism, fascism, communism, socialism, they always looking for someone, a central planning. This is exactly the problem. Because the reason that it will never works is because in your always call economic calculation problem, or I would call it the information cost is too high, in my view, because I'm a transaction cost, I'm a cost guy. And that is the biggest problem. And not to mention about that, most of the time, this kind of fascism are usually going to do what's benefiting the peers. I mean, the people around the leader. For example, like back to the point of the MPF over in Hong Kong. I mean, who benefit most? It's not the working class. It's not the people who are working. Who are not the people who are paying in. I mean, if you take a look, most of the rate of return of these pension funds are mediocre at the best.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're factoring in the inflation rate, you hardly consider it's better than you save your own money. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I would argue that if you operate it in the right manner, your ROI rate of return is higher than these funds. The biggest beneficiary is the fund managers, because no matter how terribly great or terribly bad they're having, these fund managers has to take your money. That is the colonialism that colonies that take your money, and that is another point of the fascism, because only a group of people who are surrounding the interests can be benefited, rather than ordinary people.
So yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with you. You know, the way I've argued and I've pointed out numerous times before, and I suppose you could, you know, correlate this to a question I just recently had here. You know, Adam Andak asked the question, "Hey Scotty, what are your thoughts on economic nationalism and protectionism?" Well, here's the issue, right? Because just like what you were saying there, Mike, and you're absolutely right. Economic protectionism basically leads to that very issue of corporatism, which is basically the economic element of fascism. In other words, it stems from the socialist government interventionism, because after all, for you to leave behind a capitalist system and move on the direction of this mixed economy, you're going to have to introduce all this protectionism. So, for example, the protectionist tariffs, the government regulation, etc., etc., etc. And the more and more the government interferes and controls, the more it just so happens to be, it just leads on that road where, you know, governments are so easily, you know, bought and paid for, and the government will always go on the path of its own self-interest. So when the rich have money and the poor don't, then of course, who's government going to listen to more? Who's government going to, you know, jump in bed with? Government's going to jump in bed with the big corporations, those who dominate, and they work together in the interest against the little man, the small man. And that is the problem with regards to the economic protectionism, because it cannot avoid corporatism. And it's just like Mike was explaining, that at the end of the day, you know, it's led on this path towards this oligopolistic system. It's what gives rise to the monopolies. In other words, it's not competition, it's not the free market that results in all of that. It's through government's intervention. You've got anything to add to that, Mike, that you would obviously like to respond to what Adam had questioned?
Well, I mean, protectionism never works. I mean, I correct myself. Protectionism never works for ordinary people. I mean, it always works for those who are being protected. Let's say in this way. I mean, that's why I say correct myself. Protectionism does work for those who are protected. I mean, a very good example would be a very good reminder that why the traditional Tory party are against the abolishment of corn law. I mean, because they're protecting the landlords. They are afraid of import. And that's it. That is the things that we are having the problem with. We are basically artificially pushing higher prices to the ordinary people, because despite they have a clear alternative. That is the point that I always say. I'm against protectionism, and of course this will all including, I mean, industrial protectionism, for example, like trade unionism, that is designed to protect the workers themselves by stopping and others to basically raising the bar of the entry. It's very simple, because this is not benefit consumers. That's it. Because the purpose that they do, as Friedman always said, they basically say that they are trying to make sure that the competition is being reduced.
Yep.
Yep.
So, obviously, I mean, we'll get around to responding on the TikTok issue very soon. Don't worry about that. And of course, so we'll go on to quickly, because the next question, and it was basically, how do you respond to people who persistently bring up about life in the caged housing in Hong Kong? So how do you respond to those people, because they constantly and they persistently bring up about the whole thing, because you'll know yourself, it's always a case, oh well, look at the caged housing, look at how the free market has failed, etc. and you've spoken to me before on the caged housing and the issue. What do you respond? What's your response to those people? Because obviously you've lived there, your parents lived through the whole thing. What's your response to them?
Now, first of all, the reason why this cage housing has created is back in the 1949 and 1950 and 50s because of the Communist Party getting power. There is the exception of PRC. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people fleeing down to Hong Kong. And let's face it, Hong Kong is not a particularly big land. I mean, that is a problem. That's why you have the sublet, you have the cage housing. That is everything that kickstarts. So that is the point, okay? But however, when the economy starts to develop, actually the amount of cage housing is reducing. I mean, we talk about in the 80s, 90s, there's still very, very small proportion of them still exist. I make myself very clear. I'm not suggesting that have been completely eliminated or been wiped up. But the thing is that it is very small. The funny thing is that these cage housings gets back alive, sadly, during the time of corporatism, post-1997. They start to grow again. I mean, I always ask the question. I mean, the current situation of Hong Kong is hardly... There is still a lot of freedom, things you can do. It's relatively free, but the question is the freedom is already being restrained. For example, latest, of course, we see the freedom of press has been attacked by arresting Jimmy Lai, the media tycoon. You can disagree with what he's saying, but you just simply use this kind of freedom of speech tactic I'm completely against. And that is exactly the thing. Why it is under the corporatism that actually these kind of things are going back? That is the problem that I'm going to say. And of course, another point that I always pointed out is that there is an issue we have to consider. For example, like you can see the specific part of Hong Kong and before 1990s, there's a big part of Hong Kong of cage housing. Not all of them has been concentrated in a place called Kowloon Walled City. It is basically a place that is not governed by any parties, neither British Hong Kong government, nor the British government, or the Chinese government, whatever you're going to PRC or ROC, whatever it is. I mean, just to give a sense, technically it is PRC, not ROC. But what happened, the situation was that particularly place of Kowloon Walled City, originally, the Kowloon was seated, right?
Yeah.
The Kowloon Walled City was located in there. It is kind of like a military station, like a castle type of thing.
So just to show, obviously, because this will obviously be in the next thing I was obviously going to ask is about the Kowloon Walled City. Obviously, just to give people an idea of what he's speaking about, I just want you to see just a wee short clip, and obviously he mentioned, and like I said, just in response to Craig there, as Craig was obviously asking, obviously in response, mate, in response, as you were saying about the TikTok thing, I will, because it's in a later question, and obviously we'll get on to responding about that. So we will get to that very soon. But like Mike was obviously stating about the whole thing with the caged housing, and then he goes on to mention about the Kowloon Walled City. I just want to show you guys something quick, and here you'll see obviously what it was like. Abysmal. this would have been like, with the conditions that people were living in, which is just, it's horrific to even think about. It really is. So you've got the idea of what it was like. It was basically a block that you could see was just completely crammed in, and it was the conditions were just absolutely abysmal. So the question is, obviously, Mike, and I was obviously going to ask, people mention about the Kowloon Walled City. What do you say to people who bring this up and to basically discredit capitalism as such? Now, obviously you've mentioned stuff before. What is your response on the Kowloon Walled City? And people have now got an idea, they can see the conditions.
Yes, well, first of all, technically, that is a place of anarchy, if you really want to argue, because the situation is that we have a place, first of all, as I said before, this is originally supposed to be a military station or a castle of the Qing dynasty. Later, they supposed to have soldiers inside, but as some of you might already know, the new territories was leased in 1898. The year after, in 1899, the British Hong Kong government, trying to basically get into officially occupy the place, and it have a military crash with the local villagers. The British government back then blamed that the military officials inside the Kowloon Walled City is somehow stimulating these military riots in the new territories. So they argue that as a result, they violating the self-defending clause in the that signed about the cedar of the Kowloon. So they eject them out. Mm-hmm. Now that is the thing. However, once they've been ejected out, then no one is actually running there, right? The ROC did consider to have a later when Qing Dan is being overthrown, trying to establish an embassy over there, because technically it is an exclave of China or Chinese government, whatever you want to call them, whoever ruling the mainland China, as they inherited the government. So, but they didn't. And after 1949, when there is a housing crisis, and there's a place that no one can, and by the way, the PRC don't even bother to run it, and everything starts growing up, and that is how horrific that you see it right there. I would argue that is the best example of anarchy. What happened is that until the late 1980s, both sides, the British government and the Chinese government, the PRC government, agrees that, well, this has to be sorted out. I mean, it's not mentioned by its handover anyway, so they agreed to sort it out. And the residents does have a compensation. Now, I'm not in a position to justify whether the compensation is good or not, because I don't really have enough knowledge about that. But they have compensation and they've been destroyed. Just to give an idea how lawless that place inside of the Kowloon Walled City, it is basically that. Now, there is a law in Hong Kong explicitly to prohibit people to eat cats and dogs, okay? I say it very clear. You can see this kind of dog and cat meeting shops inside there. And you cannot crack them down. And that is the things that this is there. That was a place of mess, and you cannot technically do anything to do it. Of course, the British Hong Kong government occasionally did try to intervene, but you know you don't have this right to do so. So it's very difficult to try to completely interfere and eliminate everything. So that is how the situation it is, and you could say that that was the biggest slum of Hong Kong back then, and that's why I highlight that, because majority of the time, most of the cage housing now, I would say that is inside that area. Of course, there are other cage housing outside that area, but it's relatively small, not a gigantic amount of them, and that's how the situation is. And also, I just want to add one more thing about the situation of housing and development of Hong Kong, because the more that we're getting to the 1997 and beyond, actually, the more corporatism we see. For example, like there is an example of the protection. I forgot the exact name. Basically, it's a law that is a private member's bill, basically to protect the Victoria Harbour to not to be reclaimed again, basically, unless you have a very good reasons. But the question is that now, I genuinely think that the Victoria Harbour is small enough to not to be reclaimed, but I don't believe we should have a law to push it. I mean, sometimes actually a small amount of reclaimed land is not a big deal, to be honest. But the question is that, the funny thing is that these law legislators and the people who as campaign of this actually is very close with some of the property developers. The more funny thing is that this law actually being put through after one of his property developer friends secured a seafront office building site. I mean, excuse me, this is corporatism, I mean, alright? The reason you're going to block is because you don't want someone else to build a bigger office building in front of you. You see, this is the classic thing, and that's why I want to point to, and not to mention about, of course, about the planning regulations and other thing else, and how they exchange the land. And actually, you could argue that when during the British Hong Kong time, they have a more smooth approach, because what happened was that in order to exchange the land, I mean, between the 1970s and 80s, they would just basically tell these villages in the new territories. They said that, look, we're going to give you some documents that you can claim, to claim back the land. Basically, we are one acre versus 1 acre. You understand what I mean? Mm-hmm. We call letter A, and then you have exchange them, basically land certificates, really. And they are very smart because you have the land over on there, but you cannot how do you say, build the things because it's so too small, isn't it? So what you do, you have some property developer who try to collect all this right to claim the land, and then when they collect all these kind of certificates, and then they're going to knock the door to the government to say that, look, I want to have a piece of big land somewhere in the news at satellite cities, and now I'm trying to do it. And this is how quite proven to a effective work system. But of course, this will also get to the question of the new territories part of our the villages, when they have a sum, they can claim a piece of land as a way that basically, you could argue as a way basically to let them to as a kind of compensation of about the lease. But this will be a very controversial question, and this is not something that I agree on, to be honest, because I believe in that if part of the Hong Kong people can claim that, then everyone should be claimed that. So I disagree with that. But this is the point of situation, and that's why the housing, and of course the Kowloon Walled City is one of the good reminder that actually most of the people will see when they're questioning Hong Kong, and I will ask them to take a look where they come from, because technically, as you said, that wasn't even part of the Hong Kong.
Yeah, I mean, I've said to folk before, I mean, and it's an interesting point that you made, and obviously it wasn't ruled by China, it wasn't ruled by Hong Kong, and obviously it was just it came to that agreement. The issue was yes, it was partly anarchist, but it wasn't anarchist in the sense of being, what people argue in terms of anarcho-capitalism, because people who argue with in favour of anarcho-capitalism believe in having a court system. They believe in having the rule of law. I would imagine they have things in relation to do with the non-aggression principle. There's so many things that obviously there would have been an absence within the Kowloon Walled City, but yes, I mean, it wasn't exactly under the rule of law like under Hong Kong, etc. It wasn't under China. It was an absolute disaster, so to speak. It's a bit like when Somalia had descended into so-called anarchy. It wasn't anything at all free market, and you always hear that argument being brought up, and you've probably heard it yourself, and
Sure.
that issue. So yeah, I mean, it's really, really interesting point, and I'm just going to obviously read to the next question, and there's I see there's a number of folk posting their arguments and whatnot. So basically, the next question. So, what led to the Umbrella Revolution or they call it a revolution. But what led to that in Hong Kong? Because a number of people will vaguely have heard about it. They've seen it posted in the past. Thousands took to the streets, and you've seen people with umbrellas and stuff like that. They were very upset, which in fact there was probably millions there if I could remember right. But what exactly led to that very issue? Because that's something obviously I think people would be interested to hear, obviously coming from yourself, since you're originally from Hong Kong. What led to that?
Well, I mean, I call it an umbrella movement because technically it's not a revolution. Revolution, you have a change of government. This doesn't lead to a change of government. So I would argue it is a movement, really. Well, what happened is that because after 1997, you have the freedom keep reducing, right? And every aspect has been challenged. And of course, this is the things that I always raise. I mean, you in a democratic world, or we call it democratic republic world, or sometimes in American stand is a constitutional republic, technically speaking. You have a mechanism to release the pressure by setting up the terms, because you have a functioning government that is check and balance, so they cannot drag everything too quick and fast. Because the design of the check and balance is to make sure that if there is a dictator trying to abuse the power, this can be constrained. Of course, you can always go back to the point whether it's so-called the good dictator and the bad dictator. And I believe we should not have a debate on a good dictator exists. This is something that I do not believe so. And I believe that the key question is to design a system that to decide to stand away from bad dictators. That is the point. And now you don't have such a releasing mechanism over in Hong Kong. Yes, you have legislative council, no doubt about that. But the system is being designed very carefully. Of course, you don't have a private member's bill system. You cannot challenge the Hong Kong SAR government in terms of like proposing your own laws to try to restrict it. No, you can't. You can even argue that the Hong Kong Legislative Council is almost as useless as the European Parliament. So, actually, that is the problem. And people don't have the releasing vows because they appear being suppressed. And the full-blown corporatism, what happened is that because they're not benefiting, the ordinary people is not benefiting, as a result, they want to find something to express their anger. And that's triggered the umbrella movement. I still call it movement because, as I always said, revolution means a change of government. Does it change the government after the umbrella movement? No. No, this is a fact. It doesn't lead to a change of the government. And that's why this is what I say. The problem is that you don't have a releasing mechanism. If you don't have a releasing mechanism, when it explodes, this is going to be big.
Yep. I mean, obviously, it's a very difficult thing, and like you've already explained to people, it became oligopolistic, very corporatist after 1997, and it was just like one thing after the other. The people have just been fed up, and the next question, obviously, I was going to ask in relation to that, and I don't know if any of you guys in the comments. If any of you guys have got any questions on stuff to do with this, I know that there was one question earlier on. 2 seconds, and I'll bring it up because it's an important question, and it was on the TikTok situation, and I think even Craig had asked the question as well. So basically, in these two points here, it was on the TikTok, as you can see from these two guys. So and the next question in relation to all of that, because obviously with the umbrella revolution it was starting to really infringe upon people's rights. So the question is, what do people make of the current fiasco of China infringing upon the rights of the Hong Kong people and seeking to extradite the people? Because again, that would be in relation, that would have been, a whole build up and everything. and I suppose you could fit in to do with the intellectual property rights argument, and I'm pretty sure. I do apologise. Let me just see if the comment is there.
No problem.
Pee-wee had asked it anyway. It was to do with the intellectual property rights thing, and I'm pretty sure he could ask the question again, But see, all of these things. So what is your view of that whole thing with the rights and everything? China having infringed upon the people's rights and that, and especially you can see with the TikTok they're using to spy on folk. If that was the case.
Now, first of all, I will answer the question in divided in a few chunks. I will first of all express myself on the rights of property rights, my view on that, and then I will express whether the PRC is doing what property rights it is. And next, we're going to talk about what the current extradition laws and regulations, and that is the things that I'm going to deliver. I mean, in a sense. So explain that. First of all, I believe in that private property rights, it must be respected. I'm a huge firm believer and follower of Ronald Coates, Nobel Economics Prize winner. Basically, he believing that he's a dead set against these. We call it pecuniary taxes. Basically means that like tax the externalities, like carbon tax. I mean, basically, Coates said that you do not have to tax them. All you have to do is define who has the right to emission. That's it. Because using the court and judicial system to sort this thing is rather is better than taxing them. The funny thing is that actually this persuaded Friedman. I mean, back then Milton Friedman and the Chicago School believing in pecuniary taxes. It's Ronald Coates who turned them around and later admitted one of the members of Chicago schools. Although he's in school of law, he never got into the school of economics, despite he has a PhD in economics. This is the funny thing. But anyway, he basically states very clear. Once the property rights has been defined clear, if you can just let the free market, we're going to achieve that. Once we have a free market and the property rights has been defined, we're going to have economic success. That is the basic his view. This will be a better way to summarize that. That's why I believe that the defending the property rights is absolutely crucial. Now, get to the PRC point. Are they defending the property rights of the people? Big question mark. I don't want to answer this, but yes and no. What do I mean by yes and no? For example, like these days, you see the Nike, the very well-known Jordan Air, the Michael Jordan's trainers. They were losing court cases to the mainland Chinese company called like Jordan Sports, something like that, in terms of their trademarks and everything else. But they finally get it. Okay, but you have other Japanese companies that they try to defend their own trademarks. It's failed. So it's a mixed bag. But do I believe in that they have still private property rights? Of course it does. I mean, business espionage is perfectly common around the world. But the question is that so I will not dispute on that point. But I will argue on one point is that whether they are really doing you can say it kind of legitimize what is facing stealing things. For example, if you are trying to invest a business over in China, some industry, like let's say railroad high-speed trains, right? You are forced to transfer the property rights in order to get this deal done. Is that legitimizing stealing? I mean, you could argue that, look, we are paying money to purchase it, but the question is, why? I mean, why you cannot develop your own technology? I mean, that's why you see the high-speed rail, it just goes so exponentially. You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And now, they have a problem. Because the PRC is undercut them. They do not have to pay for this kind of research costs and R&D. They try to beat them. But of course, in my view, they can't because of the low quality of stuff. Because, for example, let's take into the high-speed rail thing. It depends on what type of high-speed railway system you're trying to talk about. But if let's say, for example, like Germany, ICE system, they need to have a specific type of very high-quality steel they need to manufacture. Mm-hmm. Based on my understanding that the PRC don't have the technology yet, if you're going to use it, you're not going to make it. in my perspective, what I'm seeing is that PRCs have a very mixed bag in intelligence, defending intellectual property rights. Excuse me. So I would say this is a big question mark, and I would let you guys to judge whether this is a yes or no, because we'll see some yes case, but then we see also a plenty of no case, if you understand what I mean. So that is the thing. But of course, I believe in that overall. If you want to have cheap stuff, you cannot. I'm sorry, a little bit digress. You are always the cheap and economic goods. You always move out from one area to another area. If any so-called developed countries have to maintain their industrial capabilities, they always have to go to free market, deregulation, low taxes, and maintain high-end product. Because if you know you can't compete with these low-end products, then you're focusing on high-end. That's why I always said that, you never see Boeing have a production line or assembly line over in China, because you're focusing on high-end, top-value stuff. That's exactly what I would say. One more point I forgot. There's one more point I'm trying to address. Excuse me. I said that the third item. Sorry for my memory. The third thing I want to say is I forgot. I really forgot. If someone do remember that, just raise a question. Or Scotty, do you remember that? I said that first of all I would address the property rights, and I would. Oh yes, excuse me. I remember now. The nationality and the extradition law.
It's the whole
the
thing.
Extradition. Yes. Now I would divide it in two parts. I think the extradition law, you're talking about the extradition back to the PRC, right? Not the extradition out, I suppose, because they try to threatening to eject all the BNOs out. I mean, the extradition law is they're trying to address the problem in a bizarre way. Do they have legitimate arguments? Yes, but the law itself is bizarre. I mean, they could be send all these people back to mainland China. The trouble is that no one trusts your legal system. That's it. Period. No one trusts you. No one trusts you at all. The question is that if we're supposed to be a one country two system, although I question that because I never believe one country system can be sustainable, then you're supposed to be ring fence within Hong Kong, right? So if you want to destroy it, then you still call one country two system. Then you better run a one country one system. Of course, I'm not suggesting this is a good thing, but what I'm saying is you do not. Well, in Cantonese we have a saying: you want to claim you're a dignified woman, but you become a prostitute. Basically, this is a logical contradiction. That is exactly the point, and they're trying to do. And this is how the whole extradition is trickling everyone, because they're concerning that because the legal system will mean that anyone who says something wrong, they would manipulate the legal system and to take them to mainland China, and that is the biggest problem.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the whole situation of what you're seeing is quite a concerning thing. Especially, I think I've heard certain people have been extradited already, and the sentences is quite severe, to say the least. A lot of people are a bit concerned over the whole thing. So in relation to do with the intellectual property laws and stuff, I mean, because I can't say I really have the same sort of knowledge as some people, but I can see the value in such a thing, because the fact that, take for example, I'm a photographer, so the photographs that I take, and then it's I've got copyright over such a thing, so I can sympathise in many regards. But the whole thing, I suppose you could fit in, was that whole thing to do with the TikTok, and it was basically like you see in China with the surveillance state. Like they spy on everybody. They're watching everything you're doing, and once you live under that type of system in society, it's like they can pretty much do what they want to you. I think they even have a kind of point system where if you're good, then you'll get rewarded if you're
The
bad.
social credit system. That is the ultimate 1984 utopia. Utopia with quotes, excuse me.
That's the issue. It's quite a scary thing to say the least. And Adam had asked the question, obviously, to myself, and he asked, how do we stop the jobs from being outsourced to countries like China? And I suppose I could obviously ask yourself that. Quite an interesting question. And he says, India, Bangladesh for a lower cost, which will hurt the blue collar worker. That's my question for you, Scotty. You see, this is the issue. I mean, the free market is the solution to that. That's what enables you to bring work to your country, to be that more productive, to be competitive. That, that's where investors turn to. If you look, for example, at any country like Venezuela, countries like Venezuela went in the opposite direction. Where did the creditors go? It was the same issue with that of Greece. Greece went on the road of all that printing, borrowing and spending. Creditors are not going to stick around to pay for all of that. It's the creditors who hold the purse strings. The creditors are the ones with the money. They're more powerful than government. Because see, if your creditors pack up and leave the country, what's your government left with then in terms of money? Well, its only issue then is to turn to the printing press. And well, take a look what happened to countries like Venezuela, countries that, just went in the opposite direction. And it was like Chile in the early 1970s when they ran out of the taxpayers' money. Well, what's going to happen when you've got barely a private sector left? Well, you're forced to, turn to that of the printing press, which drove them right into hyperinflation. So this is the point, because if you want an economy that's got strong, equal opportunity in the economy, where there's vast employment opportunity, it's the free market. It's free from government. The other thing to follow with that, and like I explained there about the whole thing to do with the creditors, well, at the end of the day, if your creditors are not going to stick around, you're screwed. That was actually one of the main reasons why, when Alex Salmond was, leader of the SNP, was the first minister, when he tried to act the big shot with that oil company. I don't know if anybody will ever remember it, but it was an oil company, and it was this guy that ran it, a capitalist, and the capitalist was threatening to just pack up and leave the country with his business. And Alex Salmond all of a sudden did a U-turn. Why did he do a U-turn? Because he depends upon them for the money. You see, government is not as powerful as you think it is. Government, and the only type, it takes a specific, and this relates to the human nature argument I made before in just the previous video the other day there, and I mentioned at the end of the day, it takes a specific type of character, a specific type of socialist, a dictator, to lead you in the direction of getting rid of the private sector. You would never be able to get rid of that with the likes of a Jeremy Corbyn, or the old leader of France, or I can't even remember his name now. It's a long while ago. But
you mean the president in the 1980s, late 1980s?
No, I think it was more recent, and what he did was he raised the tax rates in France, and all of a sudden...
François Hollande. 2012.
It might have been. I can't remember. But when he raised the tax rates, it's like all of a sudden he's doing a U-turn, because that's the reality, right? It takes a Nicolas Maduro, it takes a Joseph Stalin, it takes all of that to actually get to that position of leading down that road. And economic reality defies socialism, defies collectivism. So what ends up happening is poverty. That's it. Destroys all jobs, destroys incentives, leads you to complete disaster. The economy and it leads to, like you see over and over and over in history, hyperinflation, etc, etc, etc. Because their only way to pay people's wages through the printing press. It's the inevitability of socialism. You can't oppose capitalism, you can't oppose individualism and then say, hello everybody, I'm for human nature. Just, it really doesn't work like that. And so that's why I say that when you're speaking about the blue collar worker, Adam, it's important that you have a strong private sector. And Mike could even add to that. He could even, in relation to do with Hong Kong, at the end of the day, well, when it comes to countries like China, India, Bangladesh, well, the solution to that problem, move towards a free market, open up opportunity, allow small business people to compete rather than the current system you have today where it weighs the small competitor down, and most importantly, it encourages investment. Investors, in other words the creditors, they flock to places where there is strong economic freedom, because that's where they trust their investments. As soon as you see, regimes going down the road of the likes of Venezuela, they pull out. Why? Because they know they're going to be making a loss. They know that the money that they invest is going to end up going elsewhere. They know that they'll be robbed, they'll be thieved, they'll be done for. You see, if you're an investor, think about it. If you're an investor, you're only going to invest in who you can trust because you know you're going to make a return. You're not going to make an investment in something you know you're going to make a loss, are you? Of course not. So that's the reason why, with these economies. So if you get anything, obviously, to add to that you would like to say, Mike, that obviously...
Yes, I will just quickly say a few words. Adam probably has listened to what I've said before. I always suggested that you can't competing with cost. All the developed countries, you cannot compete it with the cost. That is the question I always bring on. You are not trying to keep some of the cheap products permanently, unless you have a change of division of labor. This is a classic example we always use, because the resistance here is that you got the diminishing returns or marginal productivity theory kick in, because you have just one single division of labor unless you keep changing and changing. For example, like we still have, and in another way, basically doing high value products. For example, like you see there's expensive products like Rolls-Royce is still manufactured in UK. They still engines, they still assembly plant is still in UK. That is the thing. We are not able to just simply focusing on everything you're trying to do. Not to mention about the protectionism is not necessarily to be a good thing. As I always suggested that, first of all, you're protecting someone to access cheap products, which is terribly bad thing for the blue collar people. Not to mention about it, if you're running protectionism, you are actually discouraging people to change and improve. One very important thing, for example, like the reason that why most of the time that when you take a look at when the places get become the profit start reducing, is simply because that when you introduce a free trade, especially free trade, free trade first step, next step will be free market, because once they have a competition, you can see that they drastically changes on the situation over here. And to be quite honest with you, I believing that there's a question about dictatorship and a democracy. Now, some people argue that dictatorship leads to a better economy. Some people argue that democracy leads to a better economy. But my point will be, first of all, free market and the free trade is a necessary thing. Next, it will be the political situation. And I believe in that, can we do the, and let me organize my thought. Yes. And I believe in that anyone who trying to put liberty, put the equality first, as Friedman always said, before liberty, will usually can't achieve any of both of them. And that is the thing.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Mike. The bottom line is that there's a price to pay for trying to create equality, because what follows with equality, and this is a lot of people don't question this, they don't understand what is it that follows with equality. Well, what do you need in order to try and create that so-called equality? For you to try and create equality, what do you need? Well, you need government intervention. You need government controls over the economy. The controls over the economy lead to the opposite side effect of what they try to create. Why is that? Because the only ism with a middle class is, of course, the capitalism. Because the bottom line is, folk, you can't have, everything. There's trade-offs in the economy. So you might try to create, I'll just try and create equality, but it always leads to the opposite side effect, because the only ism with a middle class is capitalism. If the more and more you destroy capitalism, you take away the opportunity. You basically destroy the middle class. The middle class is your stepping stone. It's the door for you to open, for you to move up the ladder. When you remove that, all you create is this massive gap between the rich and poor, which is why in all socialist regimes you always see, everybody living in squalor and a 1% elite. You never see anything else with socialism. It's always the case. So that's a very good point that obviously you raised, Mike, and everything. So on to obviously the next question, and of course there is a lot of stuff that's been mentioned here. Of course I will get around to doing the thought slime videos in response to that, and I've been asked to do videos on the whole thing to do with, like I said, on what's his name? Well, sorry, her name, Vicky 1999. I've got a number of videos. I've just had personal issues I've been dealing with, which just isn't exactly, not something I've been feeling that exactly great about, but I just try to get around and fit the time in to do whatever I can for you guys. And here, the next question, obviously for yourself, Mike. The question is, what do you say to people about China trying to take away Hong Kong's BNO passport rights to prevent them from leaving? Because I know you've mentioned about the British national overseas passports and stuff like that. What's your take on that?
Now, first of all, as someone who was born and raised in Hong Kong, British Hong Kong, and then lived there until, regularly until like 7 years ago, but I'm still traveling regularly back, Not this year, sadly, because we know the COVID-19. This is one of the biggest joke I have ever seen so far. Now, I declare myself interest first. I'm a BNO, British National Overseas. Now, I make myself very clear on that. I don't want anyone to try to say that I'm wrong, or I'm trying to have a conflict of interest that I didn't know what I'm talking about. Now, first of all, BNO is a status that's given by anyone but the British government. This is a British sovereignty matter. It is simply quite naive for the PRC government to try to say that they can interfere a British matter. Now, if they did success, that could basically mean that the British sovereignty has been wiped up. And this is a bad sign. Not for we, the BNOs, but for every single British. Because that means that the government is going to kneel down to a collectivist country to do whatever they want to. If we've been wiped off, next will be you. This is the first thing. But they cannot do it anyway. There is a common misunderstanding that the BNO is just a traveling document, which is wrong again. This was not the official position of the government, British government at least, because if you Google, types of British nationalities, go to the UK government website, you will know that there are 6 types of British nationalities, and the British national overseas is one of them. The passport itself, in fact, is a byproduct of the nationality, because you can only have a passport if you have a nationality, right?
Mm-hmm.
Based on that logic, does a British citizen doesn't have a passport become a non-British citizen? No. This is the biggest nonsense I keep seeing people popping up. You understand what I mean? The common myth that we are having here, that to spin that is a traveling document, is because that PRC does not accept dual nationality. Now, this is something we have to remember that. Then, but you may ask, look, but we are technically dual nationality because we are forced to accept a PRC citizenship without our consent. So the situation in Macau, okay? So what happened that is the Standing Committee of the National People Congress, the rubber stamp parliament, so-called the PRC, they twisted the nationality of the PRC and argued that basically the nationality of these people, like in Hong Kong and Macau, actually is a byproduct of a traveling document. So that is how this comes, the whole thing of traveling document comes up, if you understand what I mean. So this is how they're based, and this is how they run the things, okay? And that is how they come from. They cannot just simply destroy something that is not given by them. However, if they wish to, they could do, because what happened was that back in 1950s, the Indonesian Chinese, because the same problem, because technically they're dual nationality. So in the PRC, in order to establish a diplomatic relationship with Indonesia very quickly, they scrap away the PRC citizenship of the Indonesian Chinese, because it's the thing that they could do. So they scrap away them without asking any question. And that is how I expect, if that have to be done, that will be go down in that way, by scrapping away the PR citizenship of the BNOs, if they really have to do something on that thing. But this will create a problem. First of all, will they also scrap away the permanent residency of Hong Kong, of the BNOs? Depends. They could. I mean, legally it is absolutely possible. I mean, to do so, but the PRC can have lots of interpretations, so I'm not going to speculate that, but it is a yes or no question. But it could happen, by the way. However, this will create a huge problem, because BNO are not inheritable. That means that you cannot pass to your kids. So what if some of the parents are BNOs but their kids are not? So we become a two-level nationality separation. You understand why I'm coming in now? And you will create huge problems if we just take the BNO out from Hong Kong, because then we have a family separation. Of course, I'm just only using one example only. You have like a husband and a wife, you have parents and kids and other thing else, and this is a glimpse of thing. And of course, this will also make the BNO become stateless right away.
Yeah.
Because the BNO does not give the right to settle in UK, although we might have a visa coming by Priti Patel, by Home Office in the January coming, but we will have to wait and see, because it's haven't kicked in yet, so I will assume this does not exist yet. So we are stateless.
Yeah, I mean...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I will quickly finish up one very thing. Because that will bring into one of the most, I dare to say, racist part of the nationality of that section. The BNOs, if you're stateless, you are allowed to convert to BC right away with one condition. You are a non-Chinese BNO. So why only a non-Chinese BNO can? You see what I'm asking the question? Of course, I expect this clause will smoothly being dealt with, being eliminated, if the situation that I mentioned happen. But the question is that the fact that there are two implications of this. First of all, there's a racist section. I mean, let's face it. Why specifically non-Chinese? I mean, it's a very simple question. Second question. This implies that actually the British government always open the position to go let the BNO come in. I mean, if you don't, why you have to give part of the BNO get in? So this is the implications that I'm going to get in, and I'm going to explain in details of the complexity, because the whole nationality law is a mess. I mean, you can start reviewing from the 1940s after World War II, and then you start the decolonization process on how the freedom movement with the empire start curtailing, restraining. It's quite a lot of history, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you've raised a number of really good points there, especially on the BNO thing, and I think the point that you had raised was the whole issue with it could lead to the split of the family, because there was, of course, and we will get around to speak about it soon, and it was the talk on the immigration thing to bring, of course, the Hong Kong citizens here, how they would manage to do that. But that was kind of one of the things that was my kind of thoughts, was the fact that but there's people who don't have the British national overseas passports, and then there's those who do, and I think it's a case that it's the younger generation who don't have access to it, so it would end up, splitting, the whole thing to do with the family that you were mentioning about, and that's a very, very good point, Mike. So following on, obviously, and I think Crod had obviously asked there the question: does this Asian lives in Hong Kong? Mike comes from originally from Hong Kong. I think he moved here, and he's been living here since 2012. So he's in the United Kingdom, but he does go back, to and forth Hong Kong, and his family, of course, his mum and dad will still, no doubt, be living in Hong Kong, and he keeps obviously regular contact and whatnot. And it's like that whole thing to do with the British national overseas, and I did, of course, ask that question because, of course, it is something that Mike feels very passionately about, and I can more than understand. I mean, the whole thing is quite a mess, so to speak, and there is quite an important thing, and it was something that was brought up recent, and I will get around to that very soon. So the next question, obviously, that I would ask yourself, Mike, I'm pretty sure it's, I know that obviously you're a strong critic of social security. Can you explain to folk, especially here in the West, why social security is so damaging, and what would be your solution?
Well, I just have a quick correction about what you said. First of all, the BNO is being stopped accepting new BNOs at the handover day before. Basically, handover take place is July 1st, 1997. The day before that is June 30th of 1997. That's the deadline. If you're born over on that day or expected born over that day, you still can apply that. Your parents can still help you to apply that. But if you're gone, I'm sorry, your parents haven't applied yet, your door is shut. That's the point, okay? That's why I said that if you were born in the 1st of June 1997, I mean, excuse me, I'm so sorry, but you're out. That's why I'll call the family separation question.
It's shocking.
And I will now also just a quick about Hong Kong citizen question. Technically, there's no definition of Hong Kong citizen. You have a permanent residence, because a British, an Italian, an American, if you have lived in Hong Kong for 7 years continuously, you will be permanent residents. So there's nothing called Hong Kong citizen. Technically, it is kind of like the old Shanghai, the bun, before 1949. That's kind of thing. So that will be the right interpretation. But now I will go back to the point of Social Security. I never believe Social Security works, because no matter Social Security, state pension, whatever you call them, the same good old thing, basically. Now, first of all, the logic of that is flawed. If you want to have a sustainable state pension system, you will have to have the people who are paying in having more than who are claiming. Very basic logic, isn't it? You have to not mention about the operation cost, so you have to be more. You have to balance the budget, right? The trouble is that once any country has been developed, the birth rate drop because opportunity costs have been the case so high. So that means that there will be a point, undoubtedly, that the people who are paying is less than the people who are claiming. So it's on course to go bust. And in fact, the problem we're having here is that you may ask, look, can we try to get the money in, trying to do other investment stuff and so? But first of all, I want to remind everyone that there's no guarantee that when you're investing, you can make a return. I mean, it's very important that you assume that when you're trying to invest something, you get a return. Now, that's why usually this kind of funds, unless they have a very designated vehicle, they will usually allow a very low risk investment, like government bonds. But I mean, excuse me, government bonds are paying the interest, but where this interest they come from? They collect from taxes. So in other words, you're asking to pay more taxes to subsidizing all the pensions and other thing else. It's just like a mess. It's just paying another tax, isn't it? Let's face it. But you may ask, look, if we have let's say for the sake of argument, a drop of birth rate, right? Can we just try to let more immigrants come in. It won't help because it will still face the same problem. And in fact, we have America. We consider as one of the most successful immigration country. Actually, their pension system will going to have a huge deficit and expected to be insolvent in the I believe in the let me quickly in the mid 1930s, if I remember correctly. It is a huge disaster. I mean, in simple terms, it's just a pyramid scheme. You are the later that you're trying to claim, the less chance that you can actually claim it. So that is a very, very huge problem. I just have a quick check. Basically, the report that is from the Heritage Foundation basically suggested that the U.S. state pension will be insolvent in 2035. So you see that is a problem. It will never works, and it never ever works, and that is the point. Well, my solution will be, first of all, we have to stop the whole pension system keep growing bigger because you'll be more problem. Let's face it, we'll keep going ahead. So instead, what we should do is basically use government bonds, basically what Friedman said, to exchange for their pension funds. So as a result, we can sort out the whole pension, stop to make the matter bigger. First thing. Second thing, we'll run a negative income tax. I'm a huge supporter of negative income tax. There's a flagship policy by Milton Friedman as a ultimate integrated safety net. Basically, it means that, for example, let's simplify the situation. Let's say you are going to have a flat rate system. Of course, you can always argue what exactly the rate it is. Like, let's say we have a personal tax allowance on £20,000. We have a flat rate system. So if you earn £12,000 is easier to calculate. Annual allowance, £12,000. You have a 10% of a tax rate. So if you are getting above that tax allowances, of course, you will not be paid. Very simple, right? If you are same amount, you won't pay anything, right? Mm-hmm. You won't receive anything. The negative income tax is that, what if you have that year you have zero income? So because you have zero income, so the allowances will paying you back, but you receive the allowances, but you're being taxed because you have to pay the tax. Let's say, for example, 12,000 a year, then you will be being taxed at a 10% rate. That means that you'll be taxed at £1,200 away. Mm-hmm. Of course, you divide it in a monthly basis, or even some of them will argue a weekly basis. And in fact, the modern technology allows to go for a detailed weekly basis because we have now, let's say in UK and the US, employers have to pay their taxes before they pay out the salary. For most of the working employees, of course, if you are running as a solo trader or like working as freelance or contractor, that's another question we have to discuss. But you can use another PAY system like in UK. But this will be the approach we can do. So this is the point. And you may ask, what if someone that is not earning full allowances, like 6,000, they will still not being taxed, but they will be subsidized back that 6,000 and maybe to tax like 10%, like £600. So, but overall there, because they will still better than doing, because the more basically we're comparing with the people who are coming out to work and to work nothing, their income actually will be higher for those who are coming to work. And that is exactly how I always believe the negative income tax is the way we should go forward, especially the current technology is much more better. And because of the NIT, you can't even have to replace the pension system, because the key question over here is that you are not going to take care of those who already have to afford to have do not have to go for pension, right? So it's only targeting those who are relatively poor. And that is how I believe that the NIT should be replaced most of the welfare scheme. Basically, you can replace all of the welfare scheme.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you've raised a lot of very good points, Mike. You see the concerning thing, and I completely agree with where you're coming from, because at the end of the day, I mean, you only have to look at Great Britain. Britain is sitting with a £9 trillion debt level. The largest contributing factor was down to the social security, not just to do with the liabilities from bailing out the banks, which we should never have done. That's not something you do under a capitalist system, and unfortunately capitalism wrongly gets the blame for it. But largely what led to the soaring debt level, and it's unsustainable. It's not something people can sustain over the long period of time, because eventually they'll face an economic collapse and they will face the consequences of it. In other words, there could potentially be a financial crisis far worse than this recession. We are not fully over the 2008 financial crisis for this reason, because it was just a case of subsidising and bailing out banks. In other words, it's just a case that you just delay the problem, and it worsens over a long period of time, which is why we're in a recession. Arguably, it's probably worse than 2008. And the whole thing with the social security was it racked up because of all the unpaid pensions, etc. Then the true debt level isn't the official debt level of what, like £2.2 trillion or something. The real debt level is actually more than £9 trillion, and that's quite. It's quite.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We have factoring in the government-owned businesses, because technically, if you accounting purposes, if you're a subsidiary, if you're your subsidiary, they will having share more than 51%. You have to calculate that. That is also the point that why I always argue that the PRC is having much more state debt, because they have so many state enterprises that actually, technically speaking, they should be counted as part of the government debt.
Absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely spot on, Mike. And like I say, I mean, it's they're going to face the heavy price. I mean, people turn around and say, well, China's doing spectacularly well. Well, they're not really. I mean, it's like you've mentioned before, it's a ticking time bomb. So the next question, obviously, because I think obviously that was in the social security. This one's quite interesting, because obviously I know that you yourself feel the same way. What do you think about the NHS? What would be your solution to healthcare?
Oh dear.
Would you support the free market? You've mentioned about Chinese medicine. What do you make of that?
Well, NHS is the biggest problem. I mean, NHS has so much ways that we're going to talk about it. I mean, we're talking about at least a billion of ways, at least. Why they're going to buy like 2 to 3 times more expensive than the private sectors of how they procurement process. For example, you can have some vitamin pills you can buy like 5 to 6 times higher than the one that you can buy out. The same type, same quality. From the drugstore that next door. This is one of the biggest laughing stock ever. And you have someone who trying to, now real case, to volunteer to help NHS, to trying to change the light bulbs, other thing else, but they refuse. They insist they have to find a handyman to spend like 60 to 70 pounds to trying to do it. And when we go on the list, I mean, for example, why the same type of product, same quality, and the hospital next door, within 2 miles, they can have a cheaper price secured at like 50% cheaper. I mean, this is reached to an insane level. No one bother. It's very simple. No one bother. I mean, for example, I also always ask the question, why respectfully to say that Western medicine are so privileged to receive government funding? I mean, why traditional Chinese medicine are not herbs like not being receive government funding? Now, make no mistakes. I'm not trying to run the things that Chinese medicine is absolutely supreme and should be replace everything. No, not at all. In fact, Chinese medicine has its weakness. And for example, like in like surgery, and like other things, for example, like in Western medicine, like you do X-ray, clean, straightforward. You can really see the broken bone, which section it is. That is something we need. We need precise clean. But we have to understand that there are some advantages for Chinese medicine, for example, like in skin, for example, like in terms of relative slow illnesses, long-term illnesses. That's the point I always suggest. And not only Chinese medicine, other type of medicine, for example, like the traditional Indian medicine, the same thing, same question that we're going to ask. In my view, what we should do is we should privatize the healthcare market. Instead of the NHS operating, what we should do, we should have a similar thing to voucher system. Now, voucher system, there are 2 approaches. Either you give back the budget to the people to they decide how they want to spend, like what type of healthcare insurance they want to buy, or you can run it based on, like I call it GP model. Because one of the biggest myths that people are trying to say that NHS is a fully government-run business is absolutely nonsense. GP has never ever been a government-run business in this country.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, funny enough, that when NHS first passed, the BMA, British Medical Association, voted 5 out of 6 of the members voted to refuse to join the NHS. None of people even remember that back then, because they insist that they will only accept join the NHS if they can work as a contractor, basically like the current model.
Yep.
You are being paid for how many patients receive. That could be one of the approach. Basically, they expand the people who accepted that. For example, like this hospital or this as a specialist, how many patients they received how many patients that they have. That they basically said, okay, we're going to pay you how many patients per head. That will be the approach. There's another approach for a voucher system. So this two approach can be, and of course, I believe that we should expand the medicines that have been accepted in this country. This back to the point of Hong Kong. Most of the people forget that actually Hong Kong, yes, there's quite a big healthcare sector of a public sector, but there is quite another kind of over half of them about the private sector, as well as the Chinese medicine. Because Chinese medicine has always been, not always been, they have been quite a long time in the private sector until the late 1990s when they trying to license it, because before that there is not even a licensing of Chinese medicines. Now I have to make myself very clear. Without licensing doesn't mean that there is no medical schools. I mean, there's two different completely concepts. I mean, you can see of private medical schools in Hong Kong. I mean, before the universities were actually holding Chinese medicine degrees. You can pay the course, and then you get in, and you're going to become not certified, but you receive a certificate from the medical school, and then you can run your own practices. Alternatively, you can join as a protege or apprentice to work your ladder come up, to try to learn the trade. That's another way that you can do. But the question is, until late 1990s, because, well, basically, again, government intervention, they said that they want to build Hong Kong and that the chief executive, the Chinese medicine hub. So they want to license it. And, well, the funny thing is that when they license it, they find a Western medicine practitioner to regulate the Chinese medicine practitioner, which I think is insane. So you find some people who do not understand the industry to try to regulate them, instead of even industrial internal regulation. I mean, well, of course, the only thing that they have to compromise is because if they want the government to recognize their authority, like issue the medical note or medical report, the same level as the Western medicine, that they will have to compromise on that, which is unfortunate. But in some sense, they have been leveled up a bit. But the funding that is still being chosen is still completely different. I mean, you can have all the money going through one sector, another one going from one sector.
Absolutely.
So I believe that we should go for a full trust system, and in that sense, basically, to basically maximize the free market. Because for me, I would prefer free market medicine. Absolutely. I mean, to be quite honest with you. But the question is that it was very difficult to go through that point. At least we have a bridging stage. So what we have to do is basically we run a full trust system. We allow as much practitioners and at the same time as much time of medicines to get in, so that people will have the right to choose to where they want to go to. And those who are not up to the job will just being kicked out from the market for good.
Yep. So to finalise, I mean, obviously that's a very interesting perspective and everything, and I completely agree with you. I think it's a case that we should move towards the free market, and you've seen my arguments of course on that, especially in relation to do with the direct primary care in the United States, and it should be moving more and more towards that direction. The whole thing. So I would say, like, just for this thing, because obviously I don't want to time me too long, so we might move on to a second part interview. But these two questions I want to ask now, which is in relation to do with the whole thing, and it was in relation to somewhat to do with the BNO thing. However, there has been talks of a chartered city being built here in Britain. If it was ever given the go-ahead, would you fully support such a move for the Hong Kong people to be given the opportunity to leave and relocate to the chartered city? And what impact do you see a chartered city having in Britain? What influence, what impact would you see it having if being the case?
Well, actually, I support that. I believe in that if a charter city charter city, new dependencies, new overseas territories, new crown dependencies, whatever you want to call them. Basically, the new free port, something like that. Like at the Adam Smith Institute have been championing for since the late 1980s. They in fact proposed a certain sites on NI and Scotland back then to see the possible options over there. I absolutely agree with that. And in fact, I wouldn't say that all the population will come in, but at least I expect like 500,000 people will come in. I mean, because this is a chance to restart everything. Of course, I'm absolutely believing that they should be have a free market, and I expect that some of the business tycoons in Hong Kong will come into. Of course, politically, they will be persuaded to come in order trying to facilitate everything happen. Um, but I'm cautiously optimistic that this will be a good start. I'm absolutely for that, and I believe that this will be a very good example to demonstrate how free market can work. Just like take a look Isles of Man. I mean, take a look. Isles of Man is a relatively free marketplace. It's not absolutely free market, but it's low tax. They successfully attract a lot of investment coming in, and that's exactly how the things are done.
Mm-hmm.
So the same thing of Cayman Islands. But unfortunately, this is not being widely shown enough. Sometimes I wonder why the media is not very interested in the overseas territories reports. I mean, why they do not focusing on reporting on these kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I can obviously completely agree with you. It's like I've mentioned before. I mean, if we were to have a chartered city, and I've argued and I saw about the Hong Kong 2.0, and basically it was to do with the whole thing that if a chartered city was to be built here, they would take obviously just an empty piece of land, and people would be able to start up, and start up their own life there, someplace in Britain. I think I also heard something about there's the possibility you could create an island somewhat between, the rest of Europe and Britain, like that part near, obviously not London, but it's just off of the,
Around the North Sea.
yeah, round,
Yeah.
because the land is so shallow. I mean, you could create something like that, and I've long argued that because it would obviously it would be a British city, but because it borders, that of all these other cities with, the taxis, etc., then it would influence the rest of them in that direction, because obviously that's where all the jobs would go, etc., etc. I mean, what obviously do you make of that in your perspective? I mean, obviously you would have your thoughts in that regard.
Well, I I absolutely agree on. And sometimes I remember my friends and I joking about if there is a charter city has been built, actually might actually suck away quite a lot of the mainland people coming in. I mean, perhaps we need to have just like what the of the it's Bermuda have done. Basically, have to set a quota because it's a small place. It's very simple. If you can run this place well, people will come. Well, just we have to trust how the people fall by their feet. I mean, that's why I always ask the question. Why does Hong Kong instead of the barrier? In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, to stop people to coming from mainland China, not the other way around.
Yeah,
Simple.
yeah, and that's the thing, because I mean, more recently, we just heard there earlier on, it was the thing to do with the British national overseas, and obviously I mentioned how it could create, and you said yourself, well, it could create the division, and they were recently talking about in Britain and bringing over, 300, was it 3 million or something? I can't remember what it was specifically. I think it was 3 million, and
Possibly that could be a 3 million around. That is possible.
yeah,
Possible for 3 million, and because we haven't calculated descendants offsprings yet, but there have been around 2.8 million estimated has survived the survival nationality holder, and that is a thing, and we have to factoring in all the kinds of their kids also. So that is the thing.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And that's the thing. I mean, unfortunate as it is to say, I mean that was in relation to do with the thing that could create split in the families and stuff like that, and certain folk wouldn't be able to get access to the British National Overseas. But I just thought, in the laws of supply and demand, folks, when it comes down to it, it's one of these sad things that, well, what kind of, what option do we have? It's a case that certain people would be left without, and that was the issue of the British National Overseas. But I think in the laws of supply and demand, there's a serious economic issue, and I think that's the very reason why the best solution to the problem, and I hope that the British government get in talks with the chartered city, institute, and for me it would be the best opportunity for, to save the Hong Kong people, that they would be given the opportunity. And I suppose I could ask the question as well. Of course, I'll obviously ask about, well, Dios has asked the interesting question there, about the John James Cowperthwaite, and what you actually think about that guy, because I think he was Scottish, of course, and he was quite important behind the foundations of the free market in Hong Kong. But I suppose the whole thing on the chartered city, as I say, I mean, we can only hope that would be the kind of, the thing, because then it wouldn't affect people that are currently living in Britain. It wouldn't take away their jobs. In fact, it would influence us to free up our own economy, and we would certainly massively benefit from it. And it wouldn't cost us anything, to set up such a thing. So that's obviously the benefit. So what?
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
I just quickly address the point. Although I would love to have a charter city, but I believe the chances that is happening is very low, because we lost the vision. I mean, after we get into the EEC and the EU, we lost the imperial vision. When I say imperial, I'm not talking about imperialism. I mean the world view, a vision that is go beyond Europe. I'm not suggesting that Europe is not important. I must stress this very clear. What I'm saying is that we have to see things beyond Europe, the whole world. They just see the importance of one small city can demonstrate the influence of the whole British country, that as a whole as the UK, and to make the UK really a great, truly global country. And I believe that is a big problem. They're now too tunnel vision, and too focused on Europe, and that is a problem.
Yeah, it is quite sad that. I mean, there is it. I mean, it's been the whole issue with the whole thing in Brexit, and of course to do with the European Union issue, and that's really the whole thing that's kind of frustrating at the moment with, the issue, because the UK government's got that to think about, and then they popped this whole issue to do with, the Hong Kong people's rights are being infringed upon. It's not a nice thing at all. It's quite harsh. So, I mean, obviously, like Dios had asked the question about Cowperthwaite. What is obviously your opinion of him, of course?
Yes, of course. I expect this question. Yes, a Scottish gentleman. Funny enough, actually, quite a lot of the officials are come from Scotland back then. I mean, even we can even joke that even business leaders come from Scotland. I mean, HSBC founder was a Scots. I don't know whether you know that, from Aberdeen, if I remember correctly. So a lot of Scottish people. That's why famously said that when HSBC is trying to take over Royal Bank of Scotland and being rejected by the British government, that back then the chairman, Sir William Previs, has not CEO, the chairman, but basically the top executive. He famously said that this is a bank founded by Scotsmen, run by Scotsmen. He himself was a Scotsman, and we cannot take over Royal Bank of Scotland. So that basically, of course, there's another competition problem and other like this kind of things, which I think is ridiculous. I mean, but overall they still take over Midland Bank, and we see this HSBC UK that we're having here right now. But anyway, John James Copperfield, someone that I agree on. I mean, he is the one who commented on positively non-interfering.
Yeah.
I love this term. I absolutely love this term because positively non-interfering. You do not interfere. You actively seek not to interfere. It does not completely rule out, but you have mostly minimized your decision, and that's basically summarize my position in my view. Because to be quite honest, I am first of all believing that to minimize the market, that is very important.
Yeah.
Sorry, excuse me. Positive non-interfere. Positive non-interfering.
Absolutely.
I correct myself. Positive non-interfering. Because this is something that because you are actively trying not to interfering. Positive non-interfering. And I believe in that we should minimize the intervention. I believe in that if the government have to really want to do something, they should use the private sector to do something. He's trying to maintain a very low taxes. For example, like he still set a tax income tax cap. But despite you have a very high income tax rate in your higher band in Hong Kong, but he set up basically anyone income tax should not exceed 15% of their total salary. Yep. So this is a very basic point. And of course, he trying to do things in a free market way. Is absolutely agree. Of course, later he cannot resist another fellow Scotsman, his boss, Lord Mallinghorst, trying to run like a state government. Excuse me, a state education, and started building the housing, public housing, which is something I will discuss after that. And the question is that he still largely maintain free market. Of course, I have my disagreement with a certain policy. For example, like Copperfield give away like to run a state education system. I mean, the government schools. I would argue that we should run a voucher system. Basically, depends on how many students you have, and then you get the money. Yeah. So in other ways, we maintain a free market instead of just government run them. So of course, there's some minor things I disagree. But overall, I have a very good thing on him. And of course, back to the point about the public housing problem. Actually, this is another myth. I mean, of course, the public housing originally when Hong Kong first built the first type of batch of public housing, actually is below British standard. I mean, we have to remember that actually the first type of public housing, actually you have to have a sharing a bathroom. I mean, public bathroom. At that time, if you take a look, the politicians over in the UK, like in Newcastle, they criticized that this kind of residence in Byker, that is not very far away from where I live, that actually this is a terrible situation. So they're building something terrible in Hong Kong. You understand what I mean? Of course, later that when they change. But the question that is we are having here is that overall, first of all, the intervention is not particularly huge. And next, when they start to build a lot of government housing later in the 1970s, the question is, it just once again demonstrates how inefficient the government it is. Because they probably keep demanding for more and more and more. I mean, why they keep demanding for more and more and more and more? Because the government cannot entertain their demand. So why they cannot entertain? Because they can never build enough. Why they not build enough? Because they are not efficient to build them.
Yeah.
Simple.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely, it's a very good point and stuff, especially in the housing and everything like that. And like I said, I mean, he's quite an interesting figure, and obviously, I've got admiration myself in that.
By the way, the person who raised this question should have quite a lot of understanding of Hong Kong, because this person is not very well known outside Hong Kong. Of course, there are some people within the circle who will praise him, but he is not very. He's not like a Milton Friedman type, classic liberal, libertarian. I'm not saying that he's not a giant, kind of an icon, shall I say.
Yeah, so obviously, I mean, there's certain things you wouldn't agree with him on and stuff like that. I can more than understand, but he was right for more or less the view of the state laying off in most regards. It's quite an interesting figure. So just to obviously finish off, and obviously there's other questions we'll go into next time and whatever, and we'll obviously get arranged to thingy, but I think one last question I think that's important to finish this off is obviously having lived in an economy strongly free from government before, what would you say to people on the free market and why you feel the rest of the world should look to the free market? Why your message to folk why the free market is the solution, why this government intervention that you've seen in Hong Kong of recent, why the free market's the answer.
Well, it's very simple. I mean, now free markets is not the perfect system. I'm not suggesting that free market is a perfect system, but as Friedman always said, this is the least worst option to eliminate poor. I mean, and it is most important is improving as solution. You take a look Hong Kong, you take a look Chile, you take a look how America at the beginning when they established. I mean, even though after the post-Civil War period, actually the funny thing is that if you take a look at the protectionism, I'm just go back to one point, the industry having protected actually growth rate is slower than the other industry. Funny, isn't it? You know, that is what I call the protectionism doesn't work. Good example. You take a look how the Britain, we the UK, when we abolish the colony, how we see these food prices going down. It is proven after and after. You take a look how the economy, when they liberalized under Deng Xiaoping. Now, I'm not suggesting that he's not a dictator. He is an absolute dictator, politically absolutely dead set on power control. But when they liberalize the economy, you can see how the economy from 1979 to 1989, almost a free market level, have completely transformed the whole PRC. We cannot deny that. You take a look how Japan, how successful it is after the Second World War. This is exactly the things we're going to see. You take a look Germany. I mean, post-World War, until the 1955, some people regarded that 10 years is a quite big free market. A tremendous transformation from a disaster World War meltdown to a successful industry that we're seeing right now. And bear in mind that most of the people, when they talk about free market, sometimes they will go to argue that Scandinavian are socialism. They're absolutely nonsense. I mean, for example, take a look at Sweden. Remember, Sweden do not have a minimum wage. Their state pension are indexing to the stock market performances. That means that if, like right now, a few months ago, the stock market collapsed, I mean, excuse me, your pension will be dropped following that. So it is hardly considered as a socialist country. I mean, most of the time, the people will not get it. For example, Hong Kong, for example, like mainland China. I just tell you that sometimes I think that the left-wing people are very stubborn. I mean, it is not about the West or whatever. Even the East are the same. I mean, for example, like Deng Xiaoping, he has some of the major political rivalries. I disagree with him on economics matter. He basically just trying to get them down to the south because, you know, the south and the onshore areas are the most economic liberalized in the most free marketeers. They just try to get them down to the south to see how success it is when you're going to see the free market kick in. They're so stubborn. They never want to move. They never go down to the south. That is the point that we're seeing. And we've seen times after times when we introduce socialism, it doesn't work. It failed epically in Soviet Union. It failed epically when the first first people when they come into America, the first bunch of them, they fail. And we have also seen that other places fail. I mean, for example, Venezuela is a very good example to remind us how epic failure it is. I mean, socialism, no, you cannot dispute that. Mm-hmm. The 1979 meltdown, the winter of discontent, I mean, the socialism it is. I mean, this very sad thing. I mean, we're trailing down to the segment of Europe. I mean, that was a disaster.
That's true.
And we have seen all these kind of things time and time again. It never works. Collectivism never works. I mean, that is why all these countries just basically collapse one after because it doesn't work.
Absolutely.
And that's what we have to. Of course, Cuba is a very good other thing. I just see you pops up on the screen. Cuba doesn't work also. I mean, Cuba is a very good example. Especially, I have to bust this myth about the Cuba thing. Because there is a common, how should I say, a common belief that actually Cuba is a very successful country in terms of socialism. But it is anything but, because we have to understand that, first of all, before the communists get into the power, actually they are already quite a developed country, not a fully developed, but quite a developed country. Now, we have to understand that before 1959, because I'm trying to take a look at some of the figures on my hand, actually the Cubans have a lower infant mortality rate than France and Germany. Okay, They have number of doctors per capita higher than UK, and the literacy rate actually higher than Spain. I mean, this is a very good success. I mean, I'm not suggesting that the Cuban government is not corrupted. I make myself very clear. It is a corrupted government. It's a dictator government. But the question is the relative and more economic freedom that we're having here before the revolution. But after the revolution, what happened? I mean, they're basically stuck in the past. They're still stuck in the past of the level. Of course, they will start in the past level. Then they will maintain. Or I will argue that actually they're going downhill, not maintaining. Excuse me. Basically saying that, how you basically say, but the question is that you're going downhill, you're still better, look like it's better. But I would ask a very basic question. If the Cuban medical situation is so successful, why Fidel Castro has a flying Spanish doctors and equipments?
Yeah, very good point. I mean, here's the thing, Mike. I mean, obviously on Cuba, from my own research, right, their high literacy rate in their education existed at 95% before Fidel Castro even took over, right?
Exactly.
So it was already there. What that's telling you, that evidence is telling you that the reason for their high literacy rate was not because of socialism. It was already there before then, right? So
exactly.
we have the evidence there. And it was the same thing with the life expectancy. The life expectancy was already, pretty good.
Quite high.
Yeah, quite
actually.
high. Before Fidel Castro took over. So we know for a fact that, it wasn't, socialism that did that. And you're absolutely right. And even, because I touched upon it in the previous video there briefly, you see, Venezuela was made out as this rich country, right, before Hugo Chavez came along. Well, not really, not quite. Yes, an oil-rich nation in terms of natural resources. But here's the thing. In the 1970s, Venezuela was very heavily dependent upon its oil boom. In 1980, that oil boom came to an abrupt end. The oil prices plummeted, right? And what that meant was Venezuela was forced into a position of trying to find where else to get money from. They would run the printing press. They would run themselves into a higher inflation. And that's how, along comes Hugo Chavez. Almost like this saviour. And what Hugo Chavez promised was, he says, I will finance your economy off the oil again. I'll get the economy going again. The truth was, the oil plummet lasted 2 decades, right up to 2 weeks before Hugo Chavez took over. So he was actually one of the luckiest guys you could think of.
Yes,
right? It was
I absolutely agree.
Sheer
and then
luck.
It started shooting up the oil price.
Yes. So basically, it was just his luck that the oil boom, a second oil boom, would take place just before he becomes the leader of Venezuela. And that oil boom lasted right up to 2007, right? So whenever someone turns around and says to you, look, it was the United States of America's fault, they got Saudi Arabia to ramp up oil production. Well, if you ramp up oil production, oil prices fall, right? They don't go up. Between 1998 right up to 2007, you saw the oil boom, right? The food shortage crisis began in 2003, at the exact same time as those, price controls, right? So in other words, the very cause of the issue was the price controls. It followed immediately after that. That's why they were facing blackouts. That's why they were facing the food shortage crisis and everything. So, I mean, you're absolutely right with regards to socialism. I mean, everywhere it's failed. I mean, even if you look at mixed economies, folk, right? Mixed economies, they've been faced with strong corporatism, the strong government regulation, monopolies have sprung up, the oligopolies like Mike mentioned earlier on. I mean, obviously, you would say yourself, Mike? I mean, obviously, in terms of the mixed economy, it's very much similar.
Oh yes, indeed, and that's one of the common thing. Not to mention about actually America, has still the biggest oil export market for Venezuela until 2017 or 18. I have to double check. But this is another myth that we have to bust because the oil sanction doesn't hitch until the last 2 or 3 years. The timing of the people just simply is absolutely all wrong. I'm not suggesting that America doesn't want to target Venezuela, but the question is you have to get your storyline right. The timeline doesn't match what they are saying.
Yep, yep. Absolutely. I mean, you're spot on in terms of everything with regards to how things were. And obviously, Thingy mentions the United Democratic Union. Says Argentina is another nation that shows what happens when you have the socialist economy. Their economy there used to be saying no one richer than Argentine, which most are now. Well, that's the thing. I mean, it used to be, I think, the late 19th century, arguably one of the richest, if not the richest country in the world at the time. Along came socialism, tore the backside out of them, and look at how they faced two defaults in the space of a decade. And Milton Friedman, of course, tried to free up Argentina as well, and it was a very sad, case that you saw with Argentina. They just don't take the hint, and the people have suffered as a result of that. It's been a very sad thing to see with regards to Argentina, and you're absolutely right. There's many countries like that in South America. So, folk, it's been obviously really interesting, and of course, there are no doubt questions that you guys might have. You get any, final questions that you guys might want to ask or that? If you want to ask Mike or that, any of you guys, if you've got any questions, then fire them away at the moment. I don't know if I've got any other questions from folk. Might be anybody typing.
No problem. I mean, you see all the comments.
Absolutely. I mean, I can see down the right here. I'll just check my Facebook and stuff and see if there's any comments other than my friend J Drew mentions. Don't forget though that major corporations have complicity in this, lobbying for protections, contracts, and bailouts. You're absolutely right in what you say, J Drew. I mean, it's just one of these things with corporatism. It's how the system is set up, and it's the unfortunate, reality. So I don't think there's really that much. When I just scroll through, just check any questions or that. It seems to have been a wee discussion that folk have had with each other. It's like, obviously some people have kind of like a debate. I suppose obviously that was quite an interesting question, but I think we had answered pretty much about that. And then Pee Wee had mentioned Karl Marx was a race realist. Yeah, I mean he really was. He's a self-loathing Jew, and he's a very horrible person. How high is the tax rate of China? I think he meant today. Is it quite high in China with regards to the tax rates? Mike?
Well, income tax rate, top rate 45%. The trouble is that now China in the past they said that if you go overseas, like the UK policies, if you're not tax residents, like for example like in UK, if you're not living in UK for more than 180 days, you don't have to compile with the UK tax law. Now China going through a so desperate of an economy that they now adopt American policy, global taxation.
Yep.
You understand what? Yep. This is a disaster. I mean, basically, in the past, the funny thing is that even though you work in Hong Kong or Macau, you still count as a non-Chinese territory. That's why I say it's always very fun. One country, two system. But anyway, so That is the point. They're desperate for money. I mean, I recall a few years ago I shared a video about the basically different provinces have their pension system over there, and because they have, I mean, the state pension system, they some of the provinces have run out of money that the central government forced those who have a surplus to surrender their surplus to other provinces.
Yes.
I mean, then why you have to have the surplus? I mean, if you are the provisional governor, you said, look, why do you have to run the surplus? Because you're going to seize them anyway, which should happen. I mean, like what we see in Europe back in the European debt crisis. I mean, like Hungary actually nationalized the old pensions. Okay? That's why pension simply because they're desperately looking for money. So that's why this kind of things, pension policy, is so easy to be seized.
Yeah.
I mean, that is also another reason we have to get rid of them.
Yeah, they're quite in a mess because of all of that. I mean, you're certainly right. I mean, it's not as rosy as people make it to be. As you know, Daniel has said, views on Ash Sarkar and her silly theory of luxury communism. You know, I'll maybe get around to doing, because I think I remember I had listed that down, and I'll definitely get around to doing a video on that at some point. And of course there was the question on thought slime. Of course, again, I'll get around to doing, you know, videos in response to that. I don't know if there's any other questions. Just scrolling through. I suppose you could say from what Adam and that this was in response, capitalism doesn't agree with social programs and social democracy. Social programs are not, you know, capitalist. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. That was the thing earlier on. I mean, social democracy is just really another name for the Keynesianism in practice. It's more or less like the corporatism. That's
yes.
What, you know,
yes.
The whole thing.
And a logical contradicting concept. I mean, you want democracy is about putting power to people, right? Socialism about centralization. So how can you centralize the thing while put the power in the back to the people? It is a bizarre concept.
Yep. So anyway, at the end of the day, I mean, just looking at everything from what I've looked at all of the comments and whatnot. I don't think there's any other questions of that. No doubt I'll get around to doing a second part, guys. Obviously, like I say, because there's obviously a good few other questions that I would obviously like to ask, and it's been very informative, especially from yourself, Mike. I mean, obviously you have provided a lot of, you know, really good information on certain things. I'm pretty sure people will be, you know, quite interested. Obviously hearing from yourself. Excuse me. But
no problem.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's been very good. So, folk, it's been on long enough. But of course, like I say, folk. So at the current time, I mean, hang on a second, Jason. Unruh looks like a beaver. Well, look, guys, I'm not I'm not going to go on about somebody's, you know, appearance as such, but it's his views that are the main problem, right? That's the main issue. So anyway, folk, what if you get any last words that you'd like to say, Mike, on anything? Anything that you would like to add at any last comments or that? Perhaps not. Anyway, folk, obviously it's been very good. It's been informative anyway, so I hope you've enjoyed the video on that, and of course we'll probably get around to doing another at some point. Righty, thank you for watching, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.